presidential debate. Very pleased to have our guest with us today. Samuel Walker is a widely quoted expert on issues of civil liberties and criminal justice policy. He's authored 14 books on those subjects. He's been interviewed in virtually every major media outlet in the United States and around the world, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, PBS Frontline, CNN, and others. He's emeritus professor of criminal justice at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, where he taught from 1974 to 2005. Walker is also an avid collector of items linked to history and music. I was amazed to read that he owns about 9,000 vinyl LPs and has amassed hundreds of original posters. But the part of his bio I like best is he said he attended movies and Bruce Springsteen concerts with his partner with a complete disregard for professional work schedules and budgets. So I think he's got his priorities right. When we got the opportunity to have Sam speak here, we jumped at it. He has a very important book. You'll be hearing about it today. It's my honor to welcome him here today, Samuel Walker. Sam?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Just drove down from Omaha this morning. Is the microphone working? We all set? Okay? All right, good. It's all true, all that introductory stuff. Now, first of all, you're probably wondering, well, how does some guy with a degree in history get into criminal justice and where he's dealing with police misconduct? And the short answer is, I needed a job. I finished my degree at Ohio State, and there were no history jobs, literally none, in the field of history at that point. And I had friends in Omaha, and they needed somebody in urban studies, which evolved into criminal justice, and it's been a career, and I've loved it ever since. One more thing, actually, on the introduction. It's true, I have 9,000 vinyl albums plus some 78s, and it's if you're wondering what this is like, well, it's really a lot like drugs. You take one hit, that feels good, and you take another, and pretty soon you're just hooked. So I'm hooked. That's it. And actually, the various interests that he mentioned in the introduction, see, they combine, because in the last 3 weeks, I have scored a major, just unbelievable coup in terms of my record collecting. We were in Chicago to hear Bruce Springsteen at Wrigley Field. It's the first time I've been to Wrigley Field, and that's the only reason I would go to Wrigley Field. But anyway, so the next Saturday, we did Chicago, the museums, and so on. Well, I went to the Jazz Record Mart, which is a very famous place, legendary place, actually. And I met Bob Koester, the owner. He's 80 years old, crusty, funny old guy. Well, they had some 78s over in the corner. I collect them for the album covers. They're just gorgeous covers. And in there was a 78 recording, which is probably it's believed to be the first recording of We Shall Overcome. 1950, before the Civil Rights Movement really gets into high gear, it was a labor song. It's actually on CIO Records. This is before the AFL-CIO merger. And I mean, I've never seen this thing advertised for sale anywhere. And so I bought it for $5. They did not know what they had. So the best part of life is going to flea markets. And people have these things, it's just some old piece of paper, and it's something very rare. Actually, this version of at this point in 1950, the actual title is We Will Overcome, not We Shall. And the lyrics go, down in my heart, not deep in my heart. It's a couple years later in the mid-50s that Pete Seeger got a hold of it, changed it from We Will to We Shall. Has a little more oomph to it, and changed the lyrics from down in my heart to deep in my heart. Wrote some new verses, and he and some others copyrighted it and put it in. The funds all go to a trust, a foundation, to support some causes. So those are my interests, and they all combine, and that's what I do. Now, the book. Now you're probably wondering, why are there no books here for sale? Like, where's the thing? Well, I made a catastrophic decision on choosing a publisher. And Cambridge University Press, they only sell to libraries. And so the price, which is a guaranteed purchase if it's a decent book. So they're not interested in selling to you. regardless of the subject. So it's been a terrible year. It's been a terrible embarrassment, and maybe there will be a paperback. It's something that you might actually consider. But if you're wondering where the book is, that's where it is. But that's another session with my counselor, next week to discuss this horribly depressing event. Anyway, Presidents and Civil Liberties. This book covers 100 years. Now, I could do the serious talk, for which I have notes, or I could do the funny talk. In the course of researching this book, I came across more events and more episodes that are funny, just unbelievable, jaw-dropping, astonishing, horrifying. I could do a whole hour-and-a-half talk just on all of that material. For example, there's Richard Nixon's last night in the White House. That was August 8th, 1974. He officially resigned on August 9th. Do you know what happened on his last night in the White House? This is his version, which he put in his memoirs. He had trouble sleeping. You just wish you'd been there and say, really? Really, Dick? You disgraced yourself, you disgraced the presidency, and you disgraced the country, and you had trouble sleeping, did you? Really? That's one. There are plenty of Lyndon Johnson stories. Middle of the Vietnam War, he went over Asia to rally the troops and show his presidential support. And he was talking to some soldiers in Korea, and he told them how he could empathize with them because my great-great-granddaddy died at the Alamo. Well, there's a reporter there and took some notes, and they fact-checked it, and his great-great-granddaddy wasn't anywhere near the Alamo, much less dying there. So several years later, after he's resigned, he's back in Austin, he's working on his memoirs, and he hired Doris Carnes. If you watch CNN, you see Doris Carnes Goodwin to help him with his memoirs. So she calls him on it. What does he do? He tells two more lies to try to talk his way out of it. First, he denies that he said it, which is the second lie, or after the first one, and then he says his great-great-granddaddy actually died at the Battle of San Jacinto, and goes on for about 10 or 15 minutes about why the Battle of San Jacinto is far more important than the Battle of Alamo. So she checks that out. His great-great-granddaddy wasn't anywhere near San Jacinto. So there are just tons of, for Nixon and Johnson alone, there are just tons of stories, and I could just go on forever. But maybe I should do the serious talk, right? I don't want to get thrown out here. The book covers 100 years, 100 years exactly. It covers Woodrow Wilson through Barack Obama, and so it really begins in the spring of 1913 with the inaugural of Woodrow Wilson to his first term in office. It covers 17 presidents, even nicely balanced, 9 Republicans and 8 Democrats. Now, there are a lot of funny stories, but there really are no revelations, no exposés, no shocking stories. I have nothing on White House sex parties that, well, the ones we didn't already know about, or CIA assassination plots that we didn't already know about. So there's really nothing for the tabloids in my book. But when you step back and look at this panorama of the last 100 years, there is a revelation. And it's actually a much more disturbing one and far more profound and important revelation. And that revelation is how little our presidents have done for civil liberties. How little our presidents have done to protect and advance civil liberties. Now, this is important because presidents are our national leaders. They are the national symbols of the country. They're spokespersons for what our country stands for. And the Bill of Rights represents our deepest values: freedom of speech and press, religious liberty, equal protection, due process of law, to be treated fairly by your government. Those are our core values. Whenever we go charging off into some misbegotten war around the country, it isn't to protect our capital gains tax rate. It's to protect the values that are embodied in the Bill of Rights. And so you would think, or you would hope, that our national leaders would be vigilant in protecting those values. They have not been. Now, it's actually worse than that. the revelation is worse than that, because several presidents have been personally responsible for some of the worst violations of civil liberties in our history. And so the first would be Woodrow Wilson. During World War I, he and his administration suppressed almost all dissent against the war, both in terms of prosecutions, people who went to prison for voicing their opposition to the war, publications that were denied mailing privileges, which really shut down the anti-war movement. And there were a lot of vigilante actions, just private citizens gang up because you looked a little too German, or you said something that was, critical of war, whatever. It's one of the worst episodes of in terms of violations of freedom of speech and press in our history. And Wilson had every opportunity to stop it, and he did not. Second is World War II. World War II, we evacuated and interned the Japanese Americans from the West Coast. 117,000 people, about 2/3 of whom were American citizens. They were not aliens. That was personally authorized by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, the only president in our history who ever put Americans in concentration camps. And all the more shameful because at that very moment we were in fact fighting Nazi Germany, which was already putting people in concentration camps. Richard Nixon, the only president to resign from office in disgrace because of the abuses associated with Watergate. He personally obstructed justice, and he abused the intelligence agencies, the FBI, the CIA, IRS, and other federal agencies against his opponents, strictly for personal political advantage. He tried to claim there were some national security issues involved in some of the things he did, but it just doesn't hold water. And then George W. Bush, the most secretive administration in our history, an administration that authorized our people to engage in torture, what's called, extreme interrogation or harsh interrogation tactics, but it really amounts to torture. It was in violation of American law, the Convention Against Torture, of international law, and all standards of human decency. And actually even worse, the Bush made extraordinary claims of presidential power, both in public and in court documents, the cases that went to the Supreme Court. He claimed that when he acted as commander-in-chief, neither the Congress nor the courts could overrule him. Well, the sound you could hear in the background was the sound of James Madison weeping. I mean, the very principle of separation of powers, which the framers of the Constitution understood was the best way to protect freedom, was to make sure that power wasn't too concentrated in any one place. George W. Bush said, no, when I act as commander-in-chief, I have all power. And that, again, was one of the worst violations of civil liberties in our history. Now, you may have noticed, I picked four extreme cases, and they were equally divided between 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans. And so, if the first theme is that our presidents have been very weak in defending and advancing the values of the Bill of Rights, individual civil liberties, it is also true that this has been a very bipartisan affair, Republicans and Democrats. I've been pointed out that I'm a sort of an equal opportunity critic on this issue, equal opportunity critics of presidents. Even though my own personal political views are very clear and I feel them very strongly, that does not stop me from criticizing those presidents who are the party of my choice. And I have a very strong choice in the current election, and I'm very critical of that person. Happens to be the president. But there's some serious things, and I'll get to that later. So this bipartisan element, and we'll get to that later. There's some notable exceptions to this rule, to this trend. The first is really Harry Truman. Harry Truman on civil rights, 1946 to 1948, was the only president who ever risked his political future on an issue of individual rights. He had a very strong civil rights position. He appointed the first presidential civil rights commission. I mean, it's hard for younger people, I think, to get a sense of that because we're just so accustomed to presidential commissions on this and that and everything else. But that was a major, major event for a presidential commission on civil rights. Roosevelt never did it. Roosevelt was not interested. And that commission issued a very thorough and hard-hitting report, which really mapped out the civil rights movement for the next 15 years. He recommended desegregating the Army, desegregating public schools, which it knew was a controversial one, and just restrictions on voting, housing, employment. Very, very important, very, very powerful document. And then in the summer of 1948, President Truman, by executive order, desegregated the military. And that was a major event. And he did that knowing full well that this would split the Democratic Party, which it did. And so the Southern Democrats walked out and they formed their own party with Strom Thurmond as their candidate. He risked his re-election. He is the only president who ever took a strong stand. And his position on civil rights was far ahead of public opinion, far ahead of white Northern opinion, Northern and Western opinion. They were not ready for this, but he took the lead. And so I think he deserves really special status in this story. The other president who deserves special mention is Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson was, without doubt, the greatest civil liberties president we have ever had. His position, he engineered, as in the Senate, he engineered the 1957 Civil Rights Act, which was weak by our standards, but very important just politically at the time. The 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Those are two of the 3 or 4 greatest pieces, most important pieces of legislation in our history. He opposed wiretapping. He publicly opposed wiretapping. He sought a law in Congress that would ban it. He issued 2 not really executive orders, they were like memos to the federal agencies. And he just went on and on about this invasion of privacy was just plain wrong. He signed the 1965 and fought for 1965 Immigration Act, which revised and eliminated the old 1924 immigration law, which was terribly biased in favor of Northern Europeans, and it discriminated against Southern and Eastern Europeans, Italians, Greeks, Jews, and so on. And so that was a major piece in our history. We've been going back the other way in our immigration policy in more recent years. Johnson was very strong on the rights of the elderly, Age Discrimination Act, and he's the only president, absolutely the only president who ever spoke out in defense of the constitutional rights of criminal suspects. And he did so on 2 occasions. And he argued that there's no war between the legitimate constitutional rights of criminal suspects and effective crime control. Now, I spent the last 30-some years in criminal justice. This is my field. I've got a book on crime policy and so on. I happen to believe that's true. And I think the evidence supports that, and that a lot of the policies that would limit the rights of criminal suspects, whatever you think of that, they're not going to increase the effectiveness of crime control. And so in many ways, he across the board on so many issues, he spoke out and on favor of Bill of Rights and the values that are in there. His speech, March 15th of 1965, his voting rights speech, calling for the passage of a voting rights bill, is one of the 3 or 4 greatest speeches by an American president. So the title is The American Promise. You can find it on the web. You can listen to it. You can find audio recordings of it. It's a great speech. There's a whole book that's written just on that speech. So again, Truman and Johnson are the 2 exceptions to this general rule of presidents not taking strong positions on this. Now, this brings us to the next theme, which is that for all of the important presidents, all the important ones, there are incredible contradictions within the records of each of those presidents. So Roosevelt, Truman, Johnson, even Nixon, others, they did some very bad things, but they also did some good things. And it's unraveling those contradictions was one of the most fascinating, challenging, and most difficult tasks that I faced. Because you come to the end of the chapter. There's a chapter for each president. And okay, what's the final assessment? What am I going to say? Now, some of them it's not that hard. Calvin Coolidge is not complicated. This is pretty much, what you see is what you got. Harding was not terribly complicated either. But for each of these presidents, so for example, with Roosevelt, this evacuating and putting Japanese Americans in concentration camps is one of the most shameful events in our history. But he did some very good things too. His Justice Department created what is the forerunner of the Civil Rights Division within the Justice Department, which was a break from the past, because it meant for the first time the Civil Rights Division would go to bat on behalf of people's rights, whether it would be voting rights or other First Amendment rights or so on, where those are violated. So Roosevelt, and probably most important, were his appointments to the Supreme Court, which transformed the Supreme Court in very short order. In our sort of shorthand version of American history, we talk about the Warren Court. The Warren Court being the great Civil Liberties Court, the tremendous expansion of individual rights. Actually, it was the Roosevelt Court which did the first really important work on First Amendment rights, religious liberty, due process rights. It was really there. And so Roosevelt deserves a tremendous amount of credit there. So how do you strike the balance? How do you strike the balance there between the good and the bad? Harry Truman, as I've said, he's the one president who risked his political career going to bat for a beleaguered minority, a discriminated against minority in this country. Really sort of forgotten in the way we tell civil rights history today, but terribly important in terms of what he did. But at the same time, he was terrible on the Cold War. Truman's Federal Loyalty Program, 1947, basically called for an automatic investigation of every single federal employee. And it embodied the principle of guilt by association. And so, Mr. Brunk, you would fall under suspicion if 10, 12 years ago, when you were in college, or it was, you had joined a particular organization at that time, or you had been to meetings, or you had certain friends, and those people were... Pardon? Lincoln Brigade, yes. You know your history well. The Lincoln Brigade were Americans who went to Spain in the late 30s to fight, to defend the established government, which was then under attack in the Civil War by the fascist side, which was supported by the Nazis and the fascists of Italy. It was a dress rehearsal for World War II. And our country did not support the established democratically elected government. So, but because the Communist Party also supported, that government, if you were there, then you were suspect, even though that was the right thing to do in that period. So, many historians argue that with his loyalty program in 1947, Harry Truman laid the foundation, sort of sowed the ground for Joe McCarthyism. Joe McCarthy doesn't arrive until early 1950, 3 years later. And so the idea of guilt by association, of, it's who you associate with, it's some idea that you believe in, even though you might be a fully loyal American. So Truman's record is very, very mixed. Eisenhower had a chance to visit the Eisenhower Library out in Abilene, do my research there. Eisenhower was very, very weak on civil rights. He was the president when Brown versus Board of Education was decided by the Supreme Court. He never strongly endorsed that decision. His press conferences are just embarrassing. I mean, he waffles around, kind of this and that, and I think many historians believe he sent a signal to the South that, if you want to resist integration, well, the president's not really going to object terribly strongly. So his record on civil rights was terrible. But he integrated Washington, D.C. When he took office in '53, he had this very strict but narrow definition of presidential powers. So we thought public schools, that's the states, that's not me. The court, that's not me. But things under the president's control, he did have a responsibility. And Washington, D.C. was a federal enclave at that time, entirely. It was also a sleepy southern town. It was fully segregated. So in terms of restaurants, in terms of movie theaters, in terms of the schools, President Eisenhower did a lot, which Truman did not do. So on the one hand, Truman was very good on civil rights at sort of a broad national level, but right there at home in Washington, he did not challenge segregation. So Truman's very mixed. Nixon's very mixed. Nixon will be forever tainted by Watergate and his obstructing justice. He was actually very good on women's rights. He was a supporter of the Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution since he was in Congress in '46, and he did so as president. He was also the president who, more than any other president, really developed affirmative action as federal policy. I mean, deep within the federal agencies. Now, neoconservatives today, of course, just want to disown him. He was kind of this mushy liberal from their standpoint. But from that standpoint, in terms of advancing equality, he was good. So the contradictions within president are really fascinating. It's a difficult challenge to kind of sort it all out. Now, those are the major themes. Presidents have really done very little to advance and defend civil liberties. It's a bipartisan story. We can't say one party's been much better than the other. There are a couple of exceptions which we have to take into account. And then there are these internal contradictions. So it's a very mixed and unclear picture, which is really fascinating. That was really the challenging part of the book. Now, having said that, if we again sort of step back and look at this 100-year panorama, and when look at how we live, the things that are the parts of our daily lives, the real story is this enormous expansion in terms of our individual rights. Pick your benchmark. You could pick 1913. One of the ones I like is June of 1960. It's when I graduated from high school. And I think of what America was like on the day I graduated from high school. On that day, there was racial segregation in the South. on that day, your employer could fire you, could call you in and fire you and say, we don't hire women. We don't want you. You're all too emotional and you just can't do a good job. And that would be legal. It was legal to do that. On the day I graduated from high school, if your affections extended to somebody of the same sex, you lived in fear. If it became public, your career was over, whatever your career was, your life was going to be in ruins, and you lived really in fear. If you were pregnant, and it was an unwanted pregnancy, you were forced to bear that child. On freedom of expression, one of the big events of my senior year in high school in Cleveland Heights, Ohio, our neighborhood movie theater, the Heights Art Theater. They were showing this French film, The Lovers, Louis Malle's. Any film buffs? Louis Malle, one of the great French directors, Les Amants. Well, the police raided it. They seized the film. Of course, high school students, we were all laughing. I'll bet they're showing it over and over again down at the police station, to see the dirty parts. That case actually went to the Supreme Court. Jacob Ellis, very important First Amendment decision. If you watch it today, you can rent it on Netflix, I think. You will look at it and you say, what? You'll be staring there, running back and forth, where are the dirty parts? There aren't any. There aren't any. There's no skin to be seen. There's no nothing. And so in the spring of 1960, if you produced a movie or distributed a movie, you ran the risk of arrest, which means that we couldn't see those movies. Actually, a couple of years before that, the famous poet Allen Ginsberg, his publisher was arrested for his poem Howl, which is now regarded as an American classic. He was arrested in San Francisco, if you can believe it. So you could be arrested for publishing a poem. On the day I graduated from high school, there was no book written on the CIA. You said, gee, I wonder what the CIA, I wonder what they're up to. I'll see, let me go read a book on it. There was no book to be had. Didn't come out until '64. The FBI was doing all sorts of things. They were doing burglaries, illegal break-ins, wiretapping, planting bugs in people's bedrooms, and recording those. We didn't know anything about it. Some of the victims knew about it, of course. And the FBI was doing, bad things with those, with that information. The day I graduated from high school, in about half of the states, you could be arrested for a burglary, be tried, convicted, and sentenced to prison without ever once talking to a lawyer. I mean, this just seems just horrible violation of just basic, fairness, that you didn't have a lawyer. In fact, Clarence Gideon, whose case, ended that, he never saw a lawyer. That was in Florida. And so, across the board today, things that we enjoy, things that we take for granted in terms of the right to speak, the right to publish, the right to read, religious liberty, in equal protection in terms of race and gender and other categories, in terms of the federal agencies, what they were doing. It was a different world, and that's within my adult lifetime. And so we have to ask the question, well, all right, if presidents didn't do it, because they haven't taken the lead, who done it? I mean, how did this happen? How do we enjoy such a broad array of individual rights that are far more extensive than in any other country of this world? Well, the answer is that it really came up from the bottom. It came from people who challenged that. People whose, one way or another, they published a poem, or they got arrested and went to prison without a lawyer, or they did sit-ins to challenge race discrimination. That movement from the bottom up, it was a lot of individual people acting alone, then with organizations, and people who would take their cases, to the court. That is how our country changed. And it is a world of difference from the world that I graduated from high school into, and world of difference from, my mother. She was born in the year 1913. She lived till 98. She just died a year and a half ago. It was a transformation. This is one of the real change in American life. If we want to understand our society and how we live and where we've been and where we're going. Historians talk about, well, there's urbanization and industrialization and globalization and the technological revolution, the digital age and all this stuff. The other way to see it is in terms of the revolution in human rights, the revolution in individual rights. And in that regard, this country leads the world. One person wrote that the Bill of Rights is America's greatest export. If you're interested in human rights, you look at all those international human rights documents, they're all modeled after the Bill of Rights. You've got First Amendment rights, freedom of speech and press, religious liberty, due process rights, equal protection. They all, one way or another, say the same thing. It's been our greatest export. Forget Boeing aircraft. Well, I probably shouldn't say that in Kansas, should I? You shouldn't. Anyway, forget aircraft, forget Hollywood stuff, forget Microsoft and all these other things that we export to the world. The Bill of Rights and the values within it. We lead the world. And that's the real story of what has happened to this country. And I think that's in general, that is for the better. Now, the other, as a concluding point, what has changed? Somewhere in the 1970s, about the mid-70s, many individual rights became well established in terms of the First Amendment, in terms of racial equality, in terms of women's rights, reproductive rights, and several of those developed fairly strong political constituencies. And what happened is what in the book I call the Great Realignment. National politics became realigned around what your TV commentators call the social issues, but we can see them as Bill of Rights issues. So it's really, it's women's rights, it's racial equality, it's the issue of pornography and censorship, the issue of prayer in school and the role of religion in government support for religion. Basically, Democratic presidents have been relatively more supportive of those, not perfectly. And Republican presidents, candidates, and other leaders have been more opposed to it. So our politics has become revolve around those issues. So there was a major change somewhere in the 70s. That's the story. And the question is I went on at length about the presidents really haven't done that much. What really has done it? I mean, this is the whodunit question. The fact is that this revolution in our life, in our lives, our country, it reflects the values and expectations of ordinary Americans. What does a good society consist of? It's a society where there's equality for all people. There's a society where there's freedom of expression for all people. We don't have the government saying, no, you can't say that or publish that. It's a government of their standards of fairness for everybody who falls into the hands of government in whatever, criminal law capacity or some other. So it's the change reflects how we have changed and what we expect in terms of our private life, all of the sexuality related kinds of issues. That's the story. It's urbanization, industrialization, globalization, technological revolution, but it's also what we want in the way of a good society. Some presidents more recently tend to agree with that. Some presidents and others are opposed to it. That is the story. I'm done. I'm happy to entertain any questions on these issues. Yes?
I respect all that you said about all the presidents, but I can't understand why you missed Warren G. Harding.
What did I miss?
Warren G. Harding, who had one of the worst reputations of
Well, it's true. He didn't do much. He didn't do anything bad, that bad. There was a lot of corruption in his administration.
Hey, folks, time out. Wait for the microphone so we
Oh.
can get your questions on video. Please wait for the microphone.
The question involves that I miss Warren G. Harding. I just think he simply didn't do very much. And he didn't do much that I thought was very good. He didn't do much that was very bad either, other than tolerate a lot of corruption. It's like Calvin Coolidge. You know, he didn't do a whole lot either. In his autobiography, Calvin Coolidge says, never do anything that you can't get somebody else to do for you. Folks, now there's really an inspiring message for your kids and your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren, right? You know, be a slacker, you know. It's in his autobiography. Other question? Back there.
Looking at this notion of civil rights and human rights, think about the right of association, the right to write, the right to listen, the right to speak, etc., those freedoms. How do we set that off against human security in this day and age when it seems to occupy an increasing importance in terms of assuring the security of Americans or written large national security? Can you talk about that a little bit and how are we to think about that?
I can talk about it a lot if you'd like to. That could actually be the subject of a separate talk. The issue before us today, the issue before the country, is this contest between liberty and security. Where do we draw the line between how much freedom we're going to encourage and tolerate as opposed to our security needs? Actually, in different forms, it's always been that way, since World War I, World War II, the Cold War, and so on. I would answer it this way, that the government has an absolutely legitimate right to ensure and responsibility to ensure the security of this country. Now, if we're talking about speech, I think the government can act and restrict things where there is a clear and immediate threat to national security. Not because you belong to some group, not because you advocate certain ideas, but when you are advocating actions that potentially threaten the country, that's where I would draw the line. I think the last two administrations, including the current one, which I support, and the previous one, I think they have gone too far in stereotyping groups because of their religion or their nationality or some other ideas, and have placed far too many restrictions on that. And so it applies both in the First Amendment area and also in the Fourth Amendment area. So, can we eavesdrop on you? Can we eavesdrop on you without a warrant? Well, I think those exceptions have to be very narrowly drawn, where there is some evidence that you are engaged in some activity that which will likely result in some harm. I think the earlier formulation, earlier decades, it was direct incitement. You can say anything you want about me. You can call me every single name in the book. That's protected. You cross the line when you say, let's get him. Let's go up there and beat him to a pulp. That's where we draw the line. Did I answer adequately?
More clarified than what I was earlier.
Right. And it's the problem. We live in a very dangerous world. There are people out there who mean us harm. There's no question about that. And determining who they are and who represents a real threat as opposed to the person who's just talking requires some very careful judgments. And we go too far when we say, well, you're actually associated with some other people, which is not what you are likely to do.
If a presidential candidate called you and said, Sam, I want to be a great custodian of civil liberties, what are the one or two things that you would want me to do in my first 100 days in office? What would you say? And conversely, what are the one or two things that a president could do that you fear most in terms of chipping away at civil liberties, given sort of the climate that we're in right now?
Well, I don't need to answer that in the abstract. I'm a Democrat. I'm a self-confessed liberal Democrat. I supported Obama. I actually sent him I like to think that my $300, put him over the top in Indiana, and in 08, won the election. But I think he's done some very, very good things. But I also think he's done some terrible things, especially in the national security area. If I can change your question and say, all right, let's say Obama wins in November and he takes the oath of office in January next year, what would and you're giving me the chance to say one thing, I would say rethink those issue of drones and targeted killings. I mean, the idea, drones are this fearsome technology where we are now fighting wars with no geographic boundaries and no time limit. World War II is easy, it's get to Berlin, get to Tokyo, we win. The war on terrorism is not clear when we win. And so we have to be very careful what we do. And I think this president, as much as I support him, but I have publicly criticized him, the idea that the president can decide, we're going to use these drones in Yemen or Pakistan or wherever, where it's not clear we have, legal authority to engage in warlike activities. I think that sets a very, very dangerous precedent. And I think it's especially the drones, they have this allure of being, surgically precise. We're gonna just bomb only your house. Well, it turns out, they make mistakes and they bomb neighboring houses and other things. It's a very, very worrisome precedent that this president is setting. And the idea that we can target and kill American citizens who are overseas without any due process, without a judicial warrant that you are in fact signed up with the Taliban and you're engaging in attacks on this country, and you're an American citizen, and for the president to sign an authorization that we're going to drop a Predator missile attack on your house over there is I think is wrong legally and very, very scary. That's the one thing I would say. Now, what things do I worry about? Well, it's actually most of the things that George W. Bush did. Authorizing torture. These harsh interrogation techniques. It shocked the conscience. It violated international law. It violated international standards of human decency. And frankly, there is abundant evidence that it was not effective, because a number of the famous people who were captured and waterboarded recanted. Well, wait a minute, they're liars, right? Yeah, but you don't know when they lied. Did they lie the first time when they gave some information, or were they lying the second time when they recanted? Maybe that was a lie to sort of throw a cloud over. Torturing people is just absolutely wrong. And so there's that. There was his aggressive use of government to promote particular religious beliefs, which I think is wrong. There's a whole bunch of things. You can use the. Let's go.
Wondered how you felt about the people at the voting places that carry threatening things and were not charged.
Well, I'm not.
That were at the polling places. Was it the Black Panthers?
Well, there have been episodes. I think the whole business of voter fraud and voter intimidation has been overblown. I just don't think there's really a systematic pattern. Again, if you threaten anybody on anything, if I threaten you today, right now, I'm committing a crime. It's more serious if it occurs anywhere near a voting. mo-
That's one for protected rights.
It is.
To go vote without any threat to us or feeling of intimidation.
Well, the threats to the right to vote are very strong. You mentioned one. I think far more are the ones that all of the voter identification laws and so on, which are going to have I think a terrible impact. I think that's a very serious episode too. I think we are right now in the middle of a very serious contest over the right to vote. Who gets the right to vote? And that it cuts several ways, but I think that is one of the major issues of the day right now.
In June, you wrote an article about this was the most important presidential election for civil liberties. Do you still agree?
Absolutely.
Now knowing more about the Republican Party.
You're going to get an A, for doing your homework. Actually, I did write a blog, and it wasn't me. It was actually Rick Santorum and Newt Gingrich, who both separately said, this is the most consequential election in generations. Far more important than 2000. Far more important, I think, than 1968 when Nixon was elected. I remember back in the time we thought, Nixon's elected, the world is, our rights are going out the window. Well, actually, our rights have grown since Nixon was president. Because you hear this, if you watch the television news, they're saying we face a fundamental choice on the economy. I agree with that too. We have two different policy perspectives, two different value initiatives about how we should go. Now, economics is not my issue, but I'm going to stay away from that. But I think in terms of national security questions, this is definitely a very consequential election. Romney's advisors just came out in the last couple of weeks that there's a paper saying that from his advisors that we should resume torture. I just think that's absolutely wrong. It makes us an international disgrace. I think it's ineffective. So I think if you watch the Republican primaries, the debates, excuse me, everyone except Ron Paul was arguing for a very aggressive foreign policy. They wanted to, do something about Iran right now, and I think it's what has gotten us in trouble. More than one occasion around the world is we've gone barging into some other part of the world with military force without thinking about the consequences, about thinking about what we're getting into. As much as I have some serious criticisms of President Obama, his policies have been far more restrained than the previous president. And I agree with that part of it. We have to be careful. We can't just say, let's send aid to Libya. Let's send aid to the Libyan rebels. Let's send aid to the Syrian rebels now. You don't know who you're buying. We don't know who those people are. We cannot control those people they think we should send aid to, and we will end up with another Vietnam and another Iraq, another Afghanistan. So on other issues in terms of the role of religion in American life, the ultimate wisdom is in the First Amendment. There are two parts. There are two religion clauses, the Establishment Clause and the Free Expression Clause. And so I think we lead the world in saying that all different religions should be respected with no penalties or whatever because somebody thinks your views are crazy or obnoxious. At the same time, the government itself should not be in the business of promoting religious doctrine because it always comes down to a particular religious doctrine. And at the time I grew up, kids in public schools in most of the country were saying prayers. Well, that happened. My friend Scott, grew up in Pennsylvania, suburban Philadelphia. That was actually a Protestant prayer. Didn't respect even Catholic, Christian prayer, much less, Jewish students and non-believing students and so on. So separating government from religion and letting all groups and all beliefs and all faiths practice freely. And the two go together. Well, I think in the current election, I think the present administration is more respectful of that. And I think within the Republican Party, there's far more stronger belief, as was true of the George W. Bush administration, that government should promote religious activities. Second row here.
Just a couple of things. One thing, you mentioned about what Eisenhower did in D.C. I think I learned much more about what he did. He did that, of course, desegregated all the federal institutions, in the Army, the schools, and things like that. So, he did do quite a bit in that area. I got this out of the new book, Eisenhower in War and Peace, by Gene Smith. Excellent volume. The other thing was that what I see that's getting back to the first of your speech there about the unconstitutionality, and when we see these signing statements, which are done, and it seems to increasingly by presidents, on the bills which have been passed and signed, and then they make a little statement that says, I will not enforce this part of the bill.
Right.
And that is becoming more and more prevalent as we go on.
Well, signing statements go back to, I think, the very beginning. And most of them were, in the old days, were press releases. And presidents would object to certain parts of the laws. What was particularly offensive about what George W. Bush did was he used it across the board. And second, if you just at random pull out most of the signing statement, you can't tell what it says. It says, I will choose to enforce section 27B of the whatever law and the Agricultural Act in accordance with my powers and duties as under the Constitution as president. You know what he's talking about. And you have to go find the bill and find an expert to tell you what that is. And so it was part of a concerted effort to in every conceivable way claim some powers of the presidency. And I think that is very, very dangerous. And I think the framers of the Constitution were just supremely wise in creating the three branches and dividing power. And what happened during those 8 years of the Bush presidency, I think are a terrible threat. He was always claiming, that he was acting under his powers as commander-in-chief. Has anybody ever read Article 2 of the Constitution, what it says there? It actually says that the president is commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy and the militia. It doesn't say he's commander-in-chief of the government. It doesn't say he's commander-in-chief of the people. It doesn't say he's commander-in-chief of the nation. It's actually fairly limited as to what powers are enumerated there. So when it says, the president is commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy, you know what that means? That means the president of the United States has absolute control over the annual Army-Navy game. He has more power than ESPN. Do you believe that? Than NCAA. That's amazing. I'm sort of joking, but he really took that one phrase and extended it. We've got a hand that's been up for some time here.
What are your views on the new media, the internet, and how censorship is coming into that, and a number of different methods that people are using to invade other people's privacy, especially as government agencies?
Well, it's an old story. Every new medium that arises creates opportunity. One person said, it was always the pornography industry that seized on new media, printing, movies, under bootleg movies and videotape and everything. People who want a greater freedom from existing laws. I think the general story is that every new medium creates new opportunities for expression. And it also creates forces, and because of that, it generates forces to suppress that. And that It was true of the press. It was true of movies. It was true of radio. It was true of television. And I think we're working our way through developing some reasonable standards. I'm not totally optimistic yet, but I think there's plenty of history that we have been through on that. Actually, it occurred to me to fully answer your question. You picked on signing statements. There are many other ways in which presidents have asserted sole authority. Executive orders. And so we have a number of presidents, and Bill Clinton was as bad as any on this. Couldn't get things through a Republican Congress, and so he did things through executive order. And of course, all the liberals said, "Oh, great, wow, it's wonderful, our policies." Well, a couple of years later, George Bush is president, and he's doing things by executive order, and the same liberals saying, "Oh, that's terrible, that's awful, it's awful." Well, that's what we call hypocrisy and double standard. And so, signing statements, executive orders, other budgetary measures, there are ways in which presidents have secrecy, just a whole government secrecy where they don't tell us what they're doing, are ways in which presidents have tended to aggregate more power to themselves. And it happens. The liberals did not criticize Bill Clinton when he did this, and he did it. And the Republicans did not criticize Bush when he did it. So it's kind of a sad story.
Yeah, going back to Woodrow Wilson. Going back to Woodrow Wilson.
We had the 18th Amendment, and I think that's really terrible because, could you imagine sitting in your house trying to drink a beer and that being illegal? Well, turning that around, since that was the 21st Amendment that overturned that, is there a possibility that people will be able to, in all 50 states, eventually get medical marijuana or, have all kinds of drugs be legal?
Well, that's a good question. That's actually in another book I've written on crime policy. There's no question that the war on drugs and our excessive use of criminal penalties on drugs has had a terrible effect on this country. We lead the world in imprisonment, the people we put in. It's both how many people we put in and the length of their sentences. I mean, it's just not a rational, humane policy. Now, and so people have seized on the war on drugs as a way of getting at this. My problem is that people have not distinguished clearly about a rational, a sensible drug policy. They say, let's legalize drugs. Well, marijuana may be one thing. Crack and meth or something else, heroin. And so I've got too many people I know too many friends actually, they want to legalize drugs. Really? So it's going to be legal for somebody to sell cocaine to your 13-year-old grandchild? I don't really think that's what you're talking about. And so some sensible, policy is somewhere in the middle there. And lowering the enforcement levels of who goes to prison for possession or even moderate amounts. But there's a lesson here. There's an important lesson from history on the issue of drugs. And the general principle is, if you take a substance or a service that people want and you try to make it a crime, people are going to find a way to get around that. And we can start with prostitution. The second oldest profession. It has never worked. Prohibition in this country was an absolute failure. The criminal abortion laws did not stop abortions from being, there's a service that people wanted. The gun laws. I mean, I don't like guns, but I have to admit that most of the gun policies that my liberal friends supported, just failure. If you live in Kansas City or Omaha or whatever, and you want a gun for some bad purpose, you will have no trouble getting a gun. We have 50 million handguns out there in the country. And so just to say, well, we'll ban them or we'll have some criminal penalty, that's not going to solve the crime problem. And so, in general, criminalizing something is a very bad way to do it. And where we've gone overboard on drugs, and we need to come back to a more sensible policy. What that policy is, I'm supposed to know, but I don't. Professor of criminal justice, was getting paid to come up with good answers. It's a very difficult problem.
I have a few questions for you. In your opinion, what was the worst violation of civil liberties over those 100 years that you covered?
Well, what was the worst violation of civil liberties in our history? I'm going to extend it, make it tougher, more history. Well, the sad news is that's a very competitive category. That's closer than the current presidential election. And there are many, many candidates. I mentioned, I think, Woodrow Wilson's suppression of free speech in World War I is a strong contender. Roosevelt's internment of the Japanese American, a frequent winner when in discussions of this. But actually, I think the greatest single violation in our history has been race discrimination in all of its manifestations. Let's get serious. Let's act like, let's do an economist or a political scientist or somebody, and we'll take the number of people involved, affected. We're talking about hundreds of millions, at least over the years, over a course of, since the Civil War, 150 some years, the areas, voting, housing, employment, education, when you multiply it all out, I think that is the greatest one, and it's one we haven't solved. The others were admittedly temporary war measures. The internment of the Japanese American was seen as an emergency war measures, which was justified under war measures. That's how the Supreme Court, justified it. When the war was over, it ended. The race discrimination is something we have not fully resolved yet. We've made a lot of progress, but we have not ended that, and so that's my candidate for the worst.
And then something else. For a country that is coming back from a recession, do you believe that it's more important for people of a country to be more focused on economic stability or advancement of civil liberties?
It's a false choice. I don't think that we should focus more on the economy than civil liberties or any other issues. We need to address all of them. One of the important things that concerns me as a criminal justice professor, you can see the consequences of the economic recession on state and local governments and the terrible impact on our criminal justice system, which means affects basic rights. So police departments have been cut back. Camden is reorganizing and Camden, New Jersey, reducing their. It's a terrible impact on effective crime control, which affects every resident. The provision of prosecutors and public defenders. There isn't enough money for those people to handle their claims, so prosecutors can't do their jobs, which on the one hand might mean that they're gonna not take some cases that they should take. There are actually some dangerous criminals, but it would take too much work to get the evidence, so we'll let that one go. Or they will do sloppy work on the cases they do take. And the public defenders don't have, even before the recession, public defenders, well-intentioned people, good people, don't have enough time to spend with their clients to develop an adequate defense. Prisons, cut back on services, personnel. So I don't think we should be forced to choose between the two. What we have to do in a time of economic hard times is to think intelligently. In my main area is policing. There are many, many creative things that police departments can do to provide more effective services, even though they may have 10 or 15% fewer officers than they had a couple of years ago. There's some internal efficiencies and prioritizing. Cutting back on drug enforcement would be one of my candidates for something that I think would be beneficial and deal with the murder, rape, robbery, and the more serious crimes. So I think that's a false choice. When do we get? You got two. Let's give. Anybody else?
In regards to civil liberties, what do you think young or new voters should keep in mind with this upcoming election?
I'm sorry, I couldn't quite.
In regards to civil liberties, what do you think young or new voters should keep in mind with the upcoming election?
What should you keep in mind? Okay. All the above. I don't think you should make those kind of distinctions. I think there are some that are more likely to affect a younger person than others. Again, I think in the national security area, there's some very scary things that could embroil this country in another shooting war, which we don't need. And I think there are other choices that would, if you waterboarded me and forced me to choose, I guess that's the one I would say is most important. Even though it seems remote, even though it seems remote, it's not going to affect us. Yes, it will. Well, if there. I've enjoyed it. Thank you very much.